everybody. Just wanted to wish everybody a happy National Carbohydrate Day. You may be asking yourself, is that really a holiday? I've never heard of it before, but it is a national holiday. Actually called in a favor with El Presidente, Mr. Barack Obama. I called him up and was like, hey, Mr. Obama, this is Mrs. Quintas. And he was like, hey, Mrs. Quintas, how are you doing? And I was like, look, I know you're a busy man, but I have a favor to ask. And he said, Mrs. Quintas, for you, the world. And I said, look, we really need to commemorate the start and just really celebrate the importance of the biological molecule unit that we're going to start just any day now. And so I really need a couple national holidays. I need National Carbohydrate Day, I need National Lipid Day, National Protein Day, and National Nucleic Acids Day. And he was like, Mrs. Quintas, you got it. So today is the second annual, since this happened last year, today is the second annual National Carbohydrate Day. So, I repeat, happy National Carbohydrate Day. Today we have a little treat. Joining us, we have a guest speaker today who wanted a good friend of mine who wanted to join us. His name is Mr. Bun, and he's going to be celebrating the day, starting off the day with a few jokes for us. So let me just go look for him. Mr. Bun, where are you? Oh, there he is. There's Mr. Bun. Hey, Mr. Bun, how you doing? I'm doing great, Mrs. Quintas. Well, Mr. Bun, I heard that you had a few jokes for us to tell. I absolutely do, so let me go ahead and get started. All right, Mr. Bun, let's hear them. Let's hear your bread jokes. Well, why doesn't bread like warm weather? I don't know, you got me stumped, Mr. Bun. Because things get a little bit toasty. That's a pretty good one, Mr. Bun. That's a pretty good one. Do you have any more for us? I sure do. Why are bread jokes always funny? I'm not really sure. Because they never get mold. Oh my goodness, Mr. Bun, you are a hoot. That is just really funny. Alright, well, Mr. Bun, we have to get pretty serious here, so I think it's time for you to go. Why? I'm on such a roll. That's very sassy and funny of you, Mr. Bun, but I think it's really time for you to go. Okay, I better go. Alright, see you later, Mr. Bun. Well, that was it for Mr. Bun. Let's all have a round of applause for him, for our guest speaker, Mr. Bun. And then let's go ahead and get serious and talk about carbohydrates. So again, happy National Carbohydrate Day. I hope you're enjoying this day pretty significantly. Let's talk about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are polymers that are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms in a 1-to-1 ratio. And you're probably saying, what the heck does that mean? So let me give you an example. So one carbohydrate that's really common and that you guys are going to be really familiar with before the end of the year is glucose. So glucose, the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. You guys are going to see this many times. So what this means is a 1-to-1 ratio. So the 1-to-1 ratio is like this. And if you guys are paying attention in math class, you know a little bit about ratios. Some of you hate math, don't worry, this is pretty easy. Okay, so 1-to-1 ratio means that for every 1 carbon and for every 1 oxygen, there are actually 2 hydrogens. So this is a molecule called, this is a carbohydrate called glucose. And you will see that pretty often. So carbohydrates are polymers that have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and you guys have heard of all of those elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, in a 1-to-1 ratio. So you guys can see that in glucose, this specific carbohydrate, there are 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So for every 1 molecule or atom of carbon and oxygen, we have 2 molecules of hydrogen. So that's pretty much that. Another note about carbohydrates is you can see it in this name right here. A lot of words that end in OSE are related to carbohydrates or sugars. So glucose, cellulose, we'll get to a lot of other names there, but a lot of words that end in OSE are related to carbohydrates. So just something to keep in mind as you're reading. Even if you read food ingredients or something like that, if something ends in an OSE, it's either a sugar or a carbohydrate. So carbohydrates are polymers that have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1:1 ratio, and you just saw an example of what that means. So that's glucose. That's an example of one type of carbohydrate. So the purpose of carbohydrates. For humans, carbohydrates serve as a main source of energy. So if you guys have ever been in any sports, especially endurance sports, you might have heard of carb loading. So maybe if you have a cross-country meet or a track meet, the next day a lot of people eat a lot of carbs the night before because carbs give us energy. So for humans, carbohydrates serve as the main source of energy. And we're not talking about like stored energy. So carbohydrates are like energy that's available right away and that we use them and burn through them. So sometimes we use our fat as energy, and we'll get to that when we talk about lipids on National Lipid Day. But it takes us a long time. Once you use up your carbohydrates, like say you're running a marathon, you're going to eventually, if you don't eat, you're going to run out of carbohydrates, and then you'll start burning fat. Or say you're lost in the desert or in the wilderness, eventually you'd run out of carbohydrates and you'd start burning your fat supplies. But for normal situations and for humans, the carbohydrates serve as the main source of energy. So if you've ever heard of people trying to lose weight, the reason that people tend to work out for longer periods of time in order to lose weight is it takes a really long time for us to burn through our carbohydrates. And then once we start burning through our carbohydrates, then we actually start burning into our fat supplies or lipids. So carbohydrates for humans is a main source of energy. So that's just one function. Another function in a lot of other living organisms, for example, a lot of plants and animals, especially small animals, use carbohydrates for structure. So examples would be, if you guys have ever seen a cockroach or stepped on a cockroach, and a lot of people here call them water bugs, but I think that's just to make people feel better about them being cockroaches. So if you've ever stepped on a cockroach or a water bug, you hear this like, it's really disgusting, but you hear this like crunch. So that crunch that you hear when you step on a cockroach is actually a really tough carbohydrate called chitin. So some animals use carbohydrates, really tough carbohydrates, for structure. So humans, we don't need an exoskeleton because we have these bones that let us keep our structure like for moving and grooving. Insects don't have they don't have a skeleton, so they need some sort of really tough structure to not be just blobs. So a lot of insects and smaller animals like sea creatures have an exoskeleton, like a really tough outer coating that actually serves as their structure. So for plants and small animals, so plants, I forgot, like this bamboo plant, which you can kind of see, it spent the whole summer with me and it's a little yellow right now, but this used to be a thriving bamboo plant, but you can still kind of tell it's very, very tough in structure. So plants also use carbohydrates for structure as well as small animals. So the actual carbohydrate in bamboo plant isn't chitin like it is in insects. The carbohydrate that's actually giving this bamboo plant all of its structure to stand upright and be really tough is actually called cellulose. So a lot of plants have that carbohydrate called cellulose, and cellulose you should be a little bit familiar with. We're actually not able to digest cellulose. Cows can do it, we can't. And if you've ever eaten celery, you may have heard that celery has negative calories. And that's actually true because your body burns through a lot of energy just trying to digest the cellulose in celery, and you can't do it, so your body wastes all this energy trying to break down cellulose, which we're not even capable of doing. So you ended up just poop it out. Okay, so cellulose is something that we can't actually break down as humans, so it just passes right through us. Okay, so plants and animals, some small animals use carbohydrates for structure. We primarily use carbohydrates for energy. A lot of other animals, larger animals, use carbohydrates for energy as well as plants. Okay, so function of carbohydrates: energy for humans, main source of energy for humans, and structure for other organisms as well. Okay, so let's talk about what makes up carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are one of the polymers. They're one of the biological molecules that we're studying. So they're made up of small repeating units. So going back to our polymer lesson, so if the polymer is a carbohydrate, we have to talk about the monomer. So these little pieces. So if the polymer, if this thing down here is a carbohydrate, then we have to talk about what is exactly the monomers that makes up these polymers. So the monomers, there are actually 3 monomers that make up carbohydrates. The first one is, or they're those building blocks. The first one is glucose, and I actually just showed that to you. Glucose, this is actually one of them, and you're going to become really familiar with what this looks like. So glucose is a really important molecule, and so you guys are going to be very, very familiar with what a glucose molecule looks like, and it's going to look very chemistry-y, but you're going to learn what it looks like. So glucose is one of the building blocks that makes up a lot of carbohydrates. So glucose is one of them, probably the most common one, and the one that we'll talk about most often. So glucose is one of them. It's one of the monomers. Fructose is actually very, very, very similar in structure to glucose, and that's actually the sugar that's found in plants, in fruits. So fructose is the sugar that's found in fruits, and interestingly enough, fructose is actually sweeter than glucose. So glucose is like the stuff found in table sugar. Fructose is the sugar that's found in fruits. And then there's also galactose, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So glucose, fructose, and galactose are just examples of different monomers or building blocks that make up polymers. So going back to our example, those are examples of monomers. So that's examples of these little pieces right here. Let's talk about examples of polymers. So there are different types of carbohydrates. There's not just one type of carbohydrate. There's starch, so a lot of starch is found in a lot of food like potatoes and bread and pasta and rice and things like that. There's glycogen, and glycogen is actually a branched chain carbohydrate. So starch is in a really straight line. You're going to see an example of that. There are all these glucose molecules lined up in a chain. Glycogen is actually branched, so it's got a chain and it's got branches that come off of it. So glycogen, you guys are going to see that on the Prezi in a little bit. So glycogen is actually the carbohydrate that sits in your bloodstream. It's like helps you be like ready to go, like ready to move and groove, and that's the carbohydrate that's in your bloodstream that you use up for movement and things like that. And then another one that we already talked about is cellulose. And cellulose is that carbohydrate that we find in a lot of plants that we can't digest. So that's just a basic rundown of carbohydrates. You might also hear a word called monosaccharide, disaccharide, and polysaccharide. So let's just talk about those. You guys should be familiar with some of these prefixes. Monosaccharide, disaccharide, and polysaccharide. Okay, let's talk about these 3 words because they're probably going to pop up somewhere in your reading and you're going to be like, what is this? So let's just talk about those. So you guys already have an idea of what these prefixes mean. Mono, again, you guys already learned that means one or single, so monosaccharide, and we'll talk about what the saccharide thing is in just a second. So monosaccharide. Di, maybe you can guess, di actually means a number, and that is 2. So a disaccharide, so 2 of these things. And a poly, you've already learned this prefix as well, so poly means many, so many saccharide. So saccharide, actually, this word actually just means sugar. Sugar. So saccharide means sugar. So this would be a single sugar. An example of a single sugar would be glucose. A disaccharide would be 2 things, and we'll talk about examples of this, a disaccharide, a little bit later. So disaccharide would be 2 sugars hooked together, and then a polysaccharide is many, many, many sugars hooked together. So many, many, many glucose molecules hooked together. So this would actually be a good example of a monomer. We know it's a monomer because it's a single sugar, a single saccharide. This would be a polymer, and this would also be a polymer. So carbohydrates are actually a bunch of sugars, tiny little sugar molecules linked together. So that monosaccharide means single sugar, di means 2 double sugar hooked together, and poly means multiple sugars hooked together. So I hope that's a good overview of carbohydrates. Again, just to review, carbohydrate is a polymer made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, 1-to-1 ratio. Functions, they serve as a main source of energy for humans, and then they serve as structure for plants and animals. And their monomers, the most important monomer is glucose. Glucose, don't forget it. If anything ends in OSE, by the way, that means it's related to a carbohydrate. So monomers, glucose. And polymers, examples are starch, glycogen, and cellulose. So I hope that serves as a good overview for carbohydrates. Again, happy National Carbohydrate Day. I hope you guys have a great day and enjoy all those carbohydrates and appreciate them for the energy that they provide you. All right, see you later.